Hello and welcome to the Inheritance Podcast. I'm Joe Riley, head of Circulus Group, a family office network based in Greenwich, Connecticut. Today we have a special guest, veteran family enterprise advisor, Fredda Herz Brown. I've been wanting to interview Fredda for a while because she is a leader in the space and her career goes back to the roots of the current theory and practice of family wealth advising. She talks today about the evolution of family systems theory, going back to Murray Bowen and Nathan Ackerman, the collaborative nature of the field's development, the importance of self-awareness for consultants, raising children amidst wealth and avoiding entitlement, and balancing separateness and connectedness in the family. We had a very rich conversation, and Fredda offered a great deal of wisdom on these crucial topics. Fredda has been a pioneer and continual innovator in the family enterprise field. She co-founded Relative Solutions to address the complexities and challenges enterprise families face at the intersection of their economy and family. She is the author of several books, including Reweaving the Family Tapestry and The Essential Roadmap, Navigating Family Enterprise Sustainability in a Changing World. Fredda has received numerous industry awards recognizing her work. She is the recipient of awards from the Family Firm Institute, where she is a fellow and founding board member. In 2002, she received the Beckert Award, named for one of her mentors, which acknowledged her contribution to practice in the field. Fredda holds a PhD in psychology, master's degrees in psychology and psychiatric nursing, and received a bachelor's degree in nursing. Please enjoy my conversation with Fredda Herz Brown.
This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Anything said by the guests or host should not be construed as legal or investment advice. Thanks for listening.
Start with your background and your education. How'd you come to this field?
I guess I should plant the little seed that I came from a family of 5 kids. And so I always was interested in complicated dynamics that would go on in our household. And also one of those kids, the older of my siblings, older than me, I'm the oldest biological child, is an adopted kid. It added really interesting complications. I wouldn't say no complications, complexity. Let's put complexity in there. So I always was interested in families. And I had a grandmother who was a nurse. And at that time, when I was growing up and getting into a field, the only things you went into was teaching nursing for women. That was about it. Those were the choices. And I didn't want to teach. That I thought I really should have probably chosen that. So I decided, okay, I'll try nursing. And I got into the first bachelor's in nursing program. And I figured I worked in peds. So that was really interesting. And then decided from there that I really loved family work enough that I wanted to specialize in it. And so I became a family therapist as I was getting my PhD in psychology. And that's all I focused on. I really just did family therapy. And family therapy for me didn't need a whole family in the room. What it needed was having a perspective on the person who's in the room with you that allows you. I always think of it as you're not just sitting with that person, you're sitting with the other people who are invisible, but are there with you with that person. And if you want to understand the person who's in the room, you have to really get a sense of the context in which they live and what they are struggling with. So I came to it just being extraordinarily interested in families and was working as the director of training at the Family Institute of Westchester, and noticed that the families that were coming in were, a number of them were families who owned businesses or had inherited wealth, and the kinds of things that psychology was saying that you should do with families. For instance, let's say kids who are being launched, how do they get independent? And everybody says they've got to be out there making money on their own. That's really for a family of great wealth or a family who owns a business. Being out there making money on your own still doesn't change the fact that you have this sum of money that is usually coming to you pretty regularly from your family, and you have to figure out where does that fit in your life. So I got interested in it from that perspective and started doing a research study on successful successions with the group. I know you must like this name, SOBs, the Sons of Bosses, but they were great. They were so interested and so committed to this research project.
How did you even get this group together?
I heard through one of my clients that was just a regular therapy client that there was this group that he belonged to called Sons of Bosses. And now his son was going to join him in Sons of Bosses. And I said, could I interest you guys in doing a research project with me where I want to collect videotapes and I want to ask certain questions about how you've transitioned your lives, business-wise and otherwise. And this guy was a big champion of the idea. And so he basically sold it. There were I think there were 3 chapters of SOBs. There still might be a chapter. I haven't looked recently out in Long Island, but they were more not like young presidents who were not interested in it because the study itself was seen as a very practical kind of thing, like how do you handle certain situations, etc. So they were just totally interested. I did about, I don't know, 20, 25 interviews and had people explore what they thought contributed to the successes they had at transitioning their businesses. And what did they have to think about in terms of their families? What did they have to think about in terms of the business? What did they think about when they had kids who really weren't either interested in the business or not competent or capable of taking on the business? That's where I just sort of landed. And I remember presenting this material to my colleagues at the Family Institute one day in which we were doing a staff day, and everybody laughed at it. They said, this is why would you do these kinds of things? Why don't you just stay with what you're doing? See families in therapy. They said, this is a whole different area, and I'm interested in trying to figure out how to deal with it. So it was pretty clear to me, Joe, that they weren't going to let me have too much space in my workload to be able to do this. So what I decided to do, and they wouldn't be contributors in terms of my thinking because they just were not thinking that way. And so I met up with Yvonne Landsberg. That was who I first met up with. And Yvonne and I then decided John Ward, Yvonne, me, Nancy Drosdow, I think Dick Beckhart was still alive, and John Davis all got together. And then we started really digging in and trying to figure out what made these families unique. What did you need to do to change the way you dealt with them versus dealing with a regular corporate client or dealing with a regular family? How did you bring all these pieces together? And it was really, we did that for a long time.
Now, most of those folks were working directly with family businesses, I assume?
Yeah, and I had started also working with family businesses by that time. I did a couple of clients with Barbara Hollander. We had a couple of clients together, and I did some with Mark Rubin, who Dick Beckhart said, you should try Mark because he's got all this knowledge about the business side of things. So you should try to see what pairing together will do with that. But we all came from our specialty areas, which is what really was interesting because it's what you first apply or first begin to think. So each of us was experiencing a broadening of the way we understood these families and our perspective on the families. So it was just an immense learning experience for me, really just grounded me in a whole different way and made me start thinking about how do you apply family system stuff to these families, and are they different, and in what ways are they different? And when you're a consultant, how is that different from what I used to be able to do as a therapist with these families? And those are all not necessarily answered questions yet, but certainly the answers to them have evolved as my practice has gotten better over time. And I think about these things really seriously.
Maybe back up a second and talk about the Family Institute of Westchester and what the state of the thinking in family systems was back then. So where did this theory come from? Was this Murray Bowen? Where did these ideas come from, essentially?
Originally, the basic ideas for family systems came from the notions of systems theory, and that each thing is related to another. And if you want to understand one, you have to have a perspective of thinking of that one in relationship to others. And so that's the best way of being able to understand anything in front of you, is to get as many truths as you can, perspectives as you can, and be able to hold varying perspectives in your head at the same time so that you really can be able to understand in front of you. So that was where it started. It then began by a number of different people who were really big in the field. Murray Bowen. There was a guy in Philadelphia, Salvador Minuchin. Ackerman, the Ackerman Institute. And Nathan Ackerman was a really interesting guy. He really came from the analytic perspective. But nobody from the Ackerman Institute actually began to take on that sort of role after Nathan passed away. But these guys were all out there and they were highly competitive with one another, although they all believed that systems was the way to go, but they were really competitive.
Competitive for clients or competitive in the field of ideas? Who's going to predominate?
Both of those, highly competitive. So they each ran their own training institute and they each tried to get as many clients as they could get. And so you had both of those sets of competitions of who's going to really predominate here. And part of the predominant is how many trainees came to your institute, but also how many families did you see and how many families felt like they were helped by your methodology. So I was lucky enough, and I really do think I entered all of this at a really good time because I decided that these people were all out there. I could use my time to just go around and see how they all function, go to their institutes, participate in all these institutes, which I did. And so I remember I used to take a plane to Richmond, Virginia, which was a prop plane, and it was forever having problems with its air pressure in the cabins. But I used to go take that thing once a month and go watch Bowen do his teaching sessions. And then eventually over time, he started to come to New York to the Family Institute of Westchester because there were enough people who wanted to see him. So he would come there. And I went to study with Mnuchin for part of the time and to see what he was doing. And he was dealing with families in Philadelphia where the poverty level was pretty high. Yeah, and so I did that with all of them. I just went around and saw what I tried to do was think about which of these theories, these models of thinking about families makes the most sense to me, that I can really imagine using this and using it as a way of approaching a client that makes sense. And could I make sense of it so that I could explain it to a client even? Because I think that's a really important thing, is for clients to be able to understand where you're coming from, because if they don't, they're just going along because you're nice or you're cute or whatever. They have to really understand it. So after a long period of time working with Murray, and also I had the great fortune of working with people who had been studying with him and who'd done a lot of their own work on their own family with Bowen. So I had that also. So I really believed in this stuff and really started to do my own practice in family therapy and really began to supervise people through one-way mirrors with put things in their ears. And that was hysterically funny, but it really also worked. So it was great. So I think what intrigued me about the Bowen theory most of all was the notion that if you got purposeful in your thinking about yourself and your family and self-reflective, that there was a way in which you could change you, whoever that you is. For me, it applied to me. I began to think about my relationships and where I was and what relationships were working and what relationships weren't working and what caused me angst and upset. And I began to think, what do I need to do to begin to shift this relationship? So it shifted the idea of where responsibility could be. I could complain all I wanted to complain about my mother or my father or whatever. But the fact is that I participate with them and I may have only 10% of the action there. But the fact is I could begin to shift something if I wanted to. So it gave me agency rather than always carrying things and being upset by it. It gave me the ability to think about, okay, so what is this about? What is my trials and tribulations with my father? What is that about in terms of the context of our family? And if I want to shift it, then what do I have to do that? So I felt like it fit me. And I began to see that as I began to make changes in myself, there were changes that happened in the relationships I had with other people. And in some instances, those people also reported that they were thinking about relationships slightly differently by thinking about what had happened between us. So it became a natural. At the same time I was doing my own thing about my own family, I started applying some of it to the work I did with clients. And it really worked. It doesn't mean that I ignored what was going on down here, but if I saw a pattern that was happening in the room with the client, or that client talked about what typically goes on, I would look to track the pattern where else it might be and begin to think about, well, here's some other places we could work on it or get some understanding of it. Because sometimes in the midst of it, you don't get great understanding, you get too much anxiety. So that's where it really started, was being able to know that I could really apply that to myself and to the clients that I dealt with. And I would do that. And so I would have people either would come in, mostly when you think about therapy clients, they're coming because there's something about themselves that's not working. Their world is just not feeling good. They're troubled by it. And the job of a therapist, and I actually think it's, when I think about myself over my lifetime, I think one of my commitments is really always to help them become more fully empowered clients. And that's what I think my mission. If there's a mission, I feel like that's what I do. I help people realize their full potential. I still have people who write to me who say, we think you, at times when we had less faith in ourselves, your faith in us being able to accomplish this and understand it was really an amazing boost to what we wanted to do. So that's what I think I started doing, working with these clients, beginning to hear and help them work through what they wanted to change in their families. And there were all sorts of things, I think, related to being a therapist, the guidelines that you have to follow. That's very different than consulting guidelines. And what you get asked to do as a therapist versus what you're asked to do as a consultant is different. But I have figured out a way to translate that for myself, and I think for others too, but not yet to be seen. I actually remember meeting Kathy Wiseman at one of the first Bowen sessions I would go to. And I also traveled to see Bowen with Monica McGoldrick. I don't know whether you know that name, but Monica.
Of course.
Yeah, Monica was one of my dear friends and colleagues. And we used to, every time we get on these planes, we both think that this is it. Just hang on for dear life. But we ended up making it there, and we both really learned a lot. In fact, I think she was exposed to Bowen before I was, at least by a couple of years.
He was very influential at the time, obviously. Why do you think those ideas were so compelling?
I think because people saw themselves in what he was saying. There were a couple of things that he said that people would scratch their head and say, forget it. What does he mean by that? His scale of differentiation. Everybody was saying, oh, what is he going there for? But for the most part, it made sense. It helped you to think about, where did you come from and what are you still carrying with you? And how are you going to break these bad habits? Because basically patterns are bad habits, right? So how are you going to break these bad habits so your life improves? And that is in your hands. You could choose to do it or you could choose not to do it. It's up to you. So I also like that piece. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. And so it became something. Bowen's first work, maybe you don't know, was with psychotic families who had a psychotic.
Schizophrenia.
Yeah.
I think if I remember correctly, it was curious that when you take the schizophrenic out of the family, and then the family became more dysfunctional. Yeah, and then you put the schizophrenic back into the family, and then the family became more normalized.
Or that more of the dysfunction focused on the schizophrenic rather than the family. So it was really his effort to try to see whether, they used to say, if you take the schizophrenic out of the family, then the family will be, the family's crazy causing the schizophrenic to be crazy. And it wasn't really that way at all. Yeah.
Which a very strange place for this, the whole theory to come from, but very revealing. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned Monica McGoldrick because she had that great book about the ethnic origins of family systems. Were you involved with that book?
I wrote one of the chapters in the original book. Yeah. She and I worked together for years. So she's wonderful.
I'm just curious about how this idea that different ethnicities and different families have different family structures and how you folks learn from that.
It wasn't even that they have different structures as much as they oftentimes have different ways of expressing processes. Like they have, if you think about, I wrote the chapter on Jewish American families and trying to look at what happens there. And that for Jews, there's in the humor part of it, people would ask, how far can you live from your parents? And it would be however long it took for a lamb chop to defrost on public transportation, which was you couldn't go very far. It's like, that's it. So that being separate from your family and being Jewish was more of a struggle, at least in the earlier generations. While the diaspora was there was also this sense of you really stayed connected. And so all of us chose a family system and tried to look at what are the issues that were particular to that ethnic group that sort of shine more. Not that they were different from others, but they had different ways of being expressed and different ways that they organized themselves. So, for instance, an Italian family and a Jewish family were extremely similar on the value of family. Family was above all. You didn't move far away from your family. You stayed close. You got there for Shabbos dinners or Sunday dinners was one or the other. But there was a very different value placed on other things that differentiated them. With Jewish American families at the time, and most of this is also, I think, time imprint, because, how it is now versus how it was 25, 30 years ago when we wrote that first book. It was what we saw happening is in the education realm. For Jews, education was like, that's it. You got to be educated and you got to go as far as you can possibly go. Versus for Italian families, the practical piece was really important. Getting educated to perform a service to the world was an important thing. And so looking at those aspects of it and getting people comfortable, giving therapists a framework to try to think about the kinds of questions you might ask, the way you might ask the questions, the way you might understand how these families are organized was what that book was about. And really, I think, help people to feel more comfortable coming into a family that they'd never lived in. If you're not Italian American, how do you understand what's going on in this family? And are there some specific things that we could give them to help them get a little better handle on it and to feel comfortable asking questions, etc.?
I was really impressed when we were talking before about this culture of collaboration early on. It sounds like you spent a lot of time with other therapists. You spent a lot of time with the Family Institute in Westchester. And then, of course, there was the Westchester Family Institute as well. But the idea that these theories and these approaches were not developed on paper, they were developed through conversation.
They were developed through interaction, some conversation. It's definitely conversation is where they evolved. But I also think that each of us had our own little areas of investigation too. So we were also taking some of the stuff we were bringing to our groups, whichever of the groups it was, that came from some other little piece of research that we were doing or examination that we were doing on our own. And that's pretty much, I think, stayed with me as a consultant all these years, that my way of learning is I do a lot of work on my own. I do a lot of thinking. I pose a lot of questions. I ask clients questions. I do some little bits of research here and there. I always have contributed research to the field, but the research I contribute to the field is also what I get interested in and want to explore with others. So once I do that piece, I come to a meeting of my collaborators where I feel like I have something to contribute to that, rather than where we can really have a collaboration and a conversation. Then I think the real good stuff starts happening, because they also come with the same thing. And everybody will say, well, God, I saw that in this family, or I'm learning to work with families that are immense, over 200 family members. And here's what I'm seeing. I'm not seeing that it's like a big bunch of people. There's a smaller organization that basically runs the family. And so you come to it with some knowledge yourself. I never do well when I just come to a meeting of any kind where I'm totally open-ended and haven't done serious thinking and exploration. I think that's definitely true of me. And I think it's probably true of every one of the collaborators I've had along the way, which is something I tell family members too. If a young person, I was just thinking that a young rising generation says they want to go to their parent and they want to have a particular conversation, I always tell them a conversation takes two prepared people. You can't go there with just one person prepared to have this conversation. Then it's not really a conversation. Then it's either they're teaching you and you're receiving, or you're teaching them. And it's not really, I always have them do a similar thing, which is, what's your part of this? How are you going to get? What is it you want to say? How would you get information to be able to say what you want to say and make it really a conversation?
I think you also mentioned that you were a bit of a therapist. And
right.
So what does a therapist talk about with their therapist?
Same thing as everybody else talks about. It's exactly the same kinds of things. It's figuring out where your life is, where you want to take charge of it, and how you're going to do that, and what parts of your life continue to influence how you are, not only as a family member, but as a professional.
I guess I'd be very curious to know one of the issues that folks have if they're just coming to the field or they're just working with these large families is finding a way to ground themselves. Families can be chaotic and there's underlying motivations. You don't even know what's going on. You also are often trying to get through some sort of a process. So I would imagine that it's very hard for people to find a way to ground themselves.
I think all the things that we've been talking about, I think are beginning ways to ground yourself, which is to figure out who you are and what you're bringing to it and what your values are and what are the guidelines you're going to use in dealing with these people, because I think intrinsically families know the answers to their challenges that they're facing, but they can't expose them because it's too hard to do that, or they have a sense that something will happen if they do it. And so the more a consultant can come understanding their own motivation for being in that room or doing this kind of work, or where that comes from in their family, or what their family's views and how their family handled things like power, control, money, leadership, typical things that come up in economic families, the more they are aware of that, at least they're grounding themselves and have something from which they can ask questions and have a better sense of where they are in it. Some of the biggest struggles with younger people, I don't know whether you've seen it, is they get enamored by the families they're working with. Very enamored, especially money enamors people, and what money buys oftentimes enamors them. So I remember I was working with a younger consultant, delightful, really smart person, and went to a client's house for the first time. And she literally could not take her eyes off of the artwork and all those things, even though we had talked about it ahead of time. And I said, you're going to walk into a house that's going to look like a showcase. And I don't know whether you've ever done that. We talked about what it was. She just couldn't. She's just totally unable to deal with it. Those kinds of things are important to help people think through and examine, because it makes a difference in the way you approach a family, and also makes a difference in what the family gives you and is willing to deal with you about because of what you're doing. Grounding yourself as a consultant, I think, is probably one of the most important things that people need to walk in with.
You also see the opposite of that, which is the resentment of the client.
Yeah, I do see it. I haven't seen it as frequently in recent years, but a long time ago, I saw it much more frequently. And it's cropping up again because of all the stuff that's going on in our society right now. Like all the talk about the billionaires getting the better deal, et cetera, et cetera. You hear much more of it because there is a disparity. No matter what you do, there's a disparity between what consultants make and what our families have. It's just a given. And dealing with that and talking about that with a young consultant, I think, is one of the best things you can offer them, because that disparity, it can often lead to resentment for the consultant, but it also leads to a sense of not being okay with the family, and the family picks up that that's there. And that gets really, I think, hairy for that to happen. But it is happening more. It's happening again. I've just started to see that a couple of times with families where the younger generation is saying that their friends are starting to say things like that. Well, your father and mother, you have your family, you've got the billions, you're the guys who are getting all the tax breaks while the rest of us are struggling. So I hear it there. I don't hear it. I hear a little bit of it in terms of being security wise with the elders in the family, like protecting our family security wise.
And so that would be something they would have to work on.
If I were to say one of the things that I've struggled with a bit in our field, and it gets expressed in a couple different ways, FFI has this training program. And I was one of the people who, as director of education and research, I think that was the title I had. But anyway, there was a committee, and Kelly Gersick was on it, and a couple of other people, representatives from each of the professions that sort of generally deal with families of wealth were there. And we all came up with this idea that people really, if we were going to be useful, we really needed to have a lot more focus on the things you and I are talking about, which is examination of self and really thinking about that, even if it was having a live client, somebody, and the focus of that being the consultant. And it never got off the ground. it's there, but in such a minor fashion, I think. It doesn't, like people map their genograms, and I have a genogram that I developed with 2164 that is a pad of paper so that people can actually, they map their genograms, but they really don't go into, so what is there in your family life that might make it harder for you with these families? What is there in the patterns and the habits that you have? And you can help them track it around different things. The areas that I told you before, they aren't really pushed to do that very much. And if you came from a therapy side, it's like one of the most important things to do. But if you come out of business, you've had no experience doing that. You may have, if you're lucky, went to therapy yourself, but who is going to give them a sense, like a big question? In therapy, one of the guidelines you have as a therapist is you don't ever have dual roles with a client. So you're not a client's friend. You don't go places with the client. You are their therapist. And their therapy, you define how long a therapy session is going to be. You define the parameters of it, etc. If you're a consultant and you came out of the business world, we can't forget that confidentiality is also a legal requirement for a therapist. If you go to the other side and you come to this whole work as being a business person, you don't have that kind of education. Having dual roles is something that's very common between people who consult and people who, like, for instance, a good example is early on was invited, and I still don't go to clients' weddings and celebrations. I'm oftentimes invited, of course, but I don't go. And it's not that I don't go because of anything about the family. It's because, as one client said to me once, when he and his brother, who were always fighting, and his brother invited me to his kid's bar mitzvah, and I was debating whether to go or not. And the guy said to me, in the light of our struggles, I view that as you are siding with his way of doing things. So I bow out. I just am not a part of that. I care about them. I work with them. I'm delighted that they feel close enough to me or think of me in that way to include me, but no way. And it's because I know that the connections you make and how you deal with a client will impact other parts of your relationship with them. It has nothing to do with the other. I also have very clear rules about confidentiality, which I'm not sure people coming from the business side of it always get. And I think we have a responsibility as people who are in the field to giving them some of that knowledge. Like, here's some of the issues. If you are also a friend with your client, here's what might come up. Going to playing golf with them, you might do it if you're a banker, but doing it as a consultant, here's some potential things that might be a challenge. Being able to talk about those things and what happens with that, which I also think helps you do what you were saying before. Who you are as a consultant becomes much more clear, because if you tackle those issues, you get much clearer on who you are as a consultant and what your job is with this family. So those are some, but I do think it's a challenge. And I think the professional organization, FFI, and I think Ultra High Net Worth Institute can do a lot to move that forward, because I think knowledge of the consultant's knowledge of self is just as important as the consultant's knowledge of the client that they're dealing with, or more.
So let's shift a little bit back towards the family. Your first book, Reweaving the Family Tapestry, you talked a lot about how the fabric of a family comes to be and their life cycle. So how do these patterns evolve? How do you think about that in a family?
So I think one of the reasons that Bowen always said to do 3 generational genograms, you could just do your father, your mother, yourself, is that you won't even get the pattern unless you go up. So unless you go up at least 2 generations, you're never going to see the pattern. You're just going to think it's what your father or mother did to you, or your sisters or brothers did to you, without understanding what sort of is underlying that. I always try to get a picture of who was related to whom, what were the alliances, what were the distances that happened in a family. I'm always interested in people who cut off from the family, who said, I don't want any part of this money and stuff, I'm out of here, or I'm not going to participate in the governance structure, I'm out of here. Because those people have a perspective that's very helpful. Usually it says something about the intensity in this family is so great that some people can't tolerate it and they just have to cut off as a way of dealing with it. So I'm always interested in finding out how those patterns work. So, for instance, when I look at my family, there are certain patterns around the way power and authority and gender get dealt with. Even though I was one of 3 daughters, then there were 2 sons afterwards. And gender in my family, because my father never knew he was going to have boys, he put a lot of energy into his girls, knowing that they had potential. Never told you there was anything that you could do. Where I got my idea about nursing and teaching had only to do with what was going on around me. But his view was you could be anything you wanted to be. And he wanted you to have that. It was really clear to me that view changed when my brothers were born. There was much less, we were pushed aside a little bit, and he put all his energy into getting his sons there. And I began to look at the issue of governance. Like, the 2 things that make a difference in governance in families are gender and generation. You're either the boss because you're older, or generally because you're the man, and whoever has the money, and traditionally has been the man who makes the money, is the one who rules. So I've always thought about what's the pattern in my family around governance? How did that shift, and what does it mean now? Why do I feel more collaborative coming out of the family I came from? So looking at patterns and identifying it, oftentimes you can get a client to tell you about it. So when a client says, my father and I are always fighting about ideas for this business, could ask a question about how her father dealt with his father around the same issues. What happened there, and how did they deal with it? How did they resolve it? Did they ever find a resolution? Has she ever asked her dad? What does she think her father was left with in terms of his sense of himself coming into this wealth as a guy who had these kinds of issues with his father? How does she think it influences what happens between the 2 of them? All of those questions, to me, are really helpful in trying to understand what I might do with her to begin to shift some of the conversations she has with him and some of the challenges in terms of patterns that exist with them. Because most families, when they're families of family enterprise, they don't come to you because they want to improve their personal relationships, I would say. Would you say that's pretty much your experience too? Mm-hmm. They come because they got to accomplish a transition, or there's a specific structural or process-oriented thing that they need to deal with. And my experience is it's when they can't deal with that, or when things go wrong, or it's too hard in dealing with that, what's underlying it's too wrong, or it's hard, or I can't do it, is some of those patterns we're talking about. If people are stuck when they come to you, or they're saying, I can't think my way out of this, or I don't get it. Why is my father so negative about blah, 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 blah? Why is he refuses to do this? Underneath all of the challenges, I think, are these interpersonal things that come from old family patterns that are repeated. And the longer the patterns are repeated, the more stuck they get. And so it's usually those, at that point, when a family's coming to you, they probably have an idea about what they need to do to get launched or to get this thing worked, but they also know what's holding it back. And helping them to articulate that, name it, and also deal with it is something that you can do. There are ways to do it that are not like digging deeply into therapy sort of stuff. You don't want to dig deeply into feelings and stuff, but there are ways of doing it, which is you can teach a family about triangles, right? You can teach somebody about how a triangle works and how his or her relationship with their father is very much related to what their mother is thinking about the business and where they stand with one another, that those things are interconnected. Teaching them about that and having them begin to know that being purposeful and thoughtful about their family is going to be much more helpful to their role and to what they're looking to get and to create than just letting it happen. People have this idea they can just let it happen. Then the more you let it happen, the more old patterns take over, because we know the brain works by habitual kind of connections, and it will work that way. So as a consultant, I can help them in that way. If it gets really difficult, and I'll give you an example, if it gets really difficult with a family and you're getting nowhere in teaching them this and helping them think, it oftentimes then I'd say, you know what, this one sounds like you're angry enough. And unable to take any other viewpoint in, that you might need to go and get some help about this, help that I can't offer you or we can't offer you, but you can get some help about it. And there's people that we know that really do that well. And so they go off or they don't go off. If they are going to go off, then they really need to go off with a positive attitude.
Should children be encouraged to go into the family business or the family office?
You get down to some of the basics that I believe in. I don't believe children should be encouraged to go anywhere. I think just because you have a family office or a family business, doesn't mean you have to encourage your kids to go. What you want to do, and as you do with any kid, is to expose them to as many things as they can be exposed to, and to think about what their interests and capabilities are. And they have different experiences like that, and being able to let them have some choices that they can make along the way. So I don't think they should necessarily be encouraged in any direction. I think they should be given experiences and opportunities to get to know the business, the family office, what it's about, so that if they get interested enough, then you can start them on an education program of where do you want to go and what do you need to actually be able to work in our family business. But I think it's really, I don't know whether I ever told you this, but I feel the only way I've ever felt envious of a family enterprise is because they're like a human capital laboratory. It's like a place where you can try out so many things. And I think if families see them as just an opportunity to try out different ideas or what you might want to do or look at this kind of relationship, then it's a great opportunity if it's used in that way, rather than thinking about it as which of my kids have to go into it or where is that going to go and how do I expose the right kid to this? So a long way around of saying, I don't think that's the right question.
How do you think about raising children in an economic family? How do you encourage resilience and responsibility and not entitlement?
It's a hard one. And since I've never been in the actual position of some of these families, I want to just acknowledge that's where I'm coming from. But I have a lot of experience over time seeing what works and doesn't work. I think one of the basic things that families and the elders in families, the parents, whoever's the older part in the family, need to have is before the situations come up, they need to have a way of thinking about it. And they need to have talked together about how do we want our children to view wealth and what do we need to do if we want our children to have that wealth. And I love to have those conversations with families because they oftentimes are eye-opening, allow the family members to express, the husband and wife to express what their thinking is, come to some conclusion, and really to think practically, what does that mean? Like I had one young couple who were thinking their family was encouraging them to think about putting their name on buildings of colleges that they wanted their kids to go to. And when they started thinking about it themselves and what that would do in terms of what they wanted their child to come, or children eventually, to come away with, that didn't at all fit with what they were hoping for. They also wanted their kids to have an experience of making money on their own. And so they thought about making sure that somewhere around 16, the kid had some kind of job where they actually got money for what they were doing. They got feedback from other people about how they were doing, and they had the experience of working with a lot of different people. So they began to think about, what is it that I want my kid to have? How do I want them to have a relationship with their wealth? How do I want them to see it? How do I see it? And how do I create an environment in which that's the case? I don't know whether you've seen that recent video of Ben Affleck with his kid. So there's this video out. I don't know whether it's still out, but Ben Affleck, who's got a teenage son, who's a loping teenager, is one they get when they don't really. So they're out shopping together in a mall, and his son sees these sneakers that he really wants. And he says, "Hey, Dad, I really want those sneakers." And his father picks up the sneakers, and the sneakers are like $600. And so he says, "No way. I'm not buying you those sneakers. And have you worked enough to have any money for it?" "No, but you've got all this money, Dad. Why can't you give me the sneakers?" It's $600 it's not a big deal. So you can see the father stopping and thinking for a minute. And he says, with a little bit of time before it, he says, "The point I don't think you're getting here is that I'm wealthy, you're not. I worked for this. And if I choose what I want to buy, I will have a choice. When you get to the stage and you also have money that you have of your own, that you can make those choices, that would be fine for you. But this is my money, not your money. And it's not shared. It's not shared money. It's my money. And I decide what's going to happen to it. As long as you're my son and you're at this age, I decide. So I thought, wow, that took a little bit of thinking to get to how do you want your kid to perceive your money? And it's not shared. It's like when I sometimes see parents giving their kids whatever they want, no matter what, whatever they'd spend on themselves, they'd spend on their kids. The equation doesn't necessarily work unless you want to have kids who expect to have that happen, that they get whatever they want. So I always think this idea of entitlement, which I wrote a paper on ages ago, and then Dennis Jaffe and I did some work on entitlement. But I always think of it when I wrote this paper, and it was about kids coming to expect what they should have, and that or they come from a particular class, they go to the schools in New York City, there's expectations about what you get and what your parents owe you because you're of a certain class. And I gave this paper to my daughter, who works in Newark, New Jersey, in the school system. And Newark was taken over for a while. I think it was taken over federally. Anyway, so I gave it to her, and I didn't hear from her. So I know when I don't hear from her, she's mulling something over. So I called her up and I said, so what's the story with this paper I gave you about entitlement? She says, I don't know. She said, I don't know why you think entitlement belongs just to the wealthy. I said, I don't think I said it belonged just to the wealthy. She said, because what I see happening, she says, is that we have a society that has set up a set of things that kids can expect. Everybody can expect a phone. Everybody has all this. They think they're entitled to that just by being born in the United States to a family. Those are theirs. And when they don't get it, they're really angry. And so I work with a bunch of younger, angry guys who don't have what they thought they were able. So if you're going to talk about entitlement, Mom, you have to talk about it also as part of a cultural issue. And I thought, she's right. She's really right. It is part of a cultural issue. But it's even the culture, the smaller culture of families who have great wealth is one that really deserves some special consideration of what does it mean to have great wealth, and how do you want to use your wealth, and what do you want your children to believe about themselves and their own worth, thinking that their own worth is tied to what they have or don't have versus what they have or don't have inside themselves. So I don't know whether that helps, but I do feel like entitlement is a bigger issue, and it really needs attention on the part of the parents before they're forced to deal with it. Going out shopping should not be your first time having to think about what will you say to your kid. Like another family recently, the little girl was out shopping with her mother. Her mother was buying shoes, and she's trying on shoes, and the kid comes over, she's about 7, comes over with a pair of shoes, and she said, I want these. And the mother said, well, you have a pair of fine shoes at home to wear, and they're of really pretty colors. And the little girl says to her, she said, but Mommy, you must have 25 shoes, black shoes. So and then the mother eventually just said, she said, the only thing I could think of saying was because I decided that this isn't what you should have. You don't need shoes. And that was all she did. She became very abrupt with the kid and cut her off because she hadn't really thought about what is her stance with her children around what she gets them.
So you mentioned before a little bit about the folks who walk away from the family and your interest in that. And maybe a larger question is, how does one maintain a separateness and connectedness to the family today?
Yeah, I think that is the bigger question, the separateness and connectedness. I think it's hard in any family to be separate while you stay connected. But if you think of a family that's joined economically, it's very hard because everything about you is all eventually spun into some kind of trust or that or something else. And there's all these connections and expectations about going to family meetings and family retreats and family vacations, etc. And that promotes the connectedness, but helping a kid figure out how are they going to be their own persons. And it even ties into thinking about going into the family business. A lot of young people even think not to do that because they just see it as, oh, another connection. I'll be here forever. So I think what I said about entitled kids is also something I think families have to seriously consider, which is, and I have those, and I know everybody at Relative Solutions with the families that they work with are often having those discussions, like how will you balance the need for being your own person separate and allow a person to develop at the same time that they stay connected to the family? What are going to be the guidelines about that so that people don't have to exit as a way of getting their own separateness? And there are simple kinds of things that people end up doing, like making the requirements for how many meetings you come to of the family, changing those so that not everybody has to be there all the time, that people are allowed some freedom to say, no, I want to do this with my family. Things at the meetings that encourage nuclear family process, leave a little time for thinking. When I do, you probably do this also, but I have for the last 6 or 7 years always leave time in any meeting I'm having with a family for solitary thought. You'll do something and then I'll ask them to take some time, write down some thoughts about it. They don't need to worry about sharing those thoughts. So it's not like back to connectedness again. It's just like, where am I? What does this mean to me? How does it influence what I'm going to do, etc.? So making sure that you value that, and in what you do, you show that you value it. And some of the most sustainable families over time that I've seen are ones who even figure out ahead of time, how does a family member get out of the economic connections if they want to get out of them? So ahead of time, thinking about like one family, in fact, one that I know pretty well over a long period of time, you can say you want out and you want to put your investment somewhere else, but you have to give a year between when you declare that and when it's actually done. And you have to go through a process that everybody's already agreed on that process. So it was developed in the family governance. It was developed by the family council. It was approved by the family governance committee. Everybody knows about it. Everybody's told about it. They have used it a few times. And in one instance, the person continued to withdraw their money. In another instance, because of the great counseling that the individual got working with some of the financial advisors, the person decided to not take as much out as they thought, but they wanted to have something that was theirs to make some decisions about. The other things that families have done, if it's about economic resources, have been to have some leeway in how much investment of their money they wanted to put into a particular project or a particular investment that the family is doing, so that they have some sort of sense of, we all don't have to be the same. We all don't have to value this the investment in the same way. And I think when people making an assumption that all people need time away, everybody needs it. You can't always be around your family. The thing you're battling against, I think, is family think. There used to be a term called group think, that people come into a group and the whole group takes over your thinking. Family think is even worse, from my point of view, because these are people you've known for years and you want to stay connected to them, and you're going to have Thanksgiving dinner with them next year. So you really are forced into this family think. So how in the midst of family think do you get time for yourself? And that, I think, deserves the attention of the full family. It's when it comes down to the family doesn't attend to it and the individual is struggling with, how do I get a little bit separate from that it ends up in a horrible place oftentimes where they just withdraw everything and go somewhere else. And that's not what you want to see.
Fredda, thank you for joining us and sharing your wonderful insights.
Thank you for having me. It was a nice conversation. I appreciate you doing this thinking with me. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and take a minute to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it.